Whenever you rent or buy a video, you need to be sure that the film you choose is suitable for the audience at home.
Do sit down. We're just about to have some tea.
Ladies and gentlemen, please do not panic, but scream! Scream for your lives!
Hey up, weirdos, the kettle's boiled. Welcome to Tea for Terror, where we take a favourite horror film and dissect it over a nice cuppa. I'm your host, Andrew Graves, and my guest today is here to ask, are we not men? Welcome, James Rose.
Hello, thank you. Hello. Thank you for having me back on. It's good to be back.
I know, it's good to be back. I've not done this for, just been having a chat beforehand, saying how busy things have been, and that's so. If you've obviously, there's been quite a gap since the last episode of Tea for Terror back in December. So with our Christmas special, so I've been not going to go into it because it's boring, but I just had a lot of stuff on, which is so yeah, I'm back, and we're back, and James is back, which is good. Yes. So, what you been up to?
All sorts. I've been getting on with a lot of commissions, really, trying to sort of clear them up because they're all sort of bottlenecking. But I've just had a piece published in a relatively new zine called Absolutely Fucking Horrifying, which is a great little magazine, absolutely fantastic. It's it's a really nice space because it's welcoming all writers, and you don't necessarily have to be a writer to sort of published writer to contribute to it. It's sort of bringing together all sorts of different things. So on one hand, you've got a lot of academic stuff in it, and on the other, you've just got a list of someone's favorite horror films, which is absolutely fantastic. And it's sort of like it just opens up you to different ways of sort of looking at film and finding out new films, because that's one of the great things about sort of horror fandom, that we all see lots of different things, and sharing those things is it's just a real vital part of your own sort of horror sustenance, for the want of a better term. So the article I've had in that is about Robert Morgan's sort of live action, if you can call it that, debut stop motion, because it blends a lot of animated sequences. So that's been really good. I've just done a really interesting piece for myself, really exciting piece about fandom and Mad Max, which was only meant to be quite short, and it's escalated into something the more I dug into it. And I can't recommend enough your listeners looking into the fandom of Mad Max, because it is it's borderline insane, I think, just like the films. Really, these people want to be barbarians in a post-apocalyptic world, and it just looks like a really warm, welcoming fandom. But
Well, I'd say give it a couple of weeks, and their dream may come true.
yeah, but that's the harrowing thing about it, that I didn't realize this existed until I started researching for this article. There's a thing called the Wasteland Weekend, which is a couple own a vast tract of desert, and they turn it into essentially Bartertown from Beyond Thunderdome. But the thing about it is, it's not a spectator event, it's purely participation. So you buy your ticket and you have to go in full costume, and you enter into Bartertown and you live there for the weekend. So you sleep there, you eat there, you drink there, and you live for arguably 48 hours in the post-apocalyptic wasteland. And it's absolutely bonkers. Looking at their website's beautiful. It's got some amazing photographs, some amazing text in it. But what if, for those that are listening and that are interested, find the website. It's easy to find, Wasteland Weekend, and then look at the rules for living there. It's like pages and pages and pages, because they want you to participate in a future event, and it's just bonkers. But it's also really, it just looks really welcoming. I know that's a weird thing to say, but it's like people from all over the world fly in and spend a weekend being in a Mad Max Bartertown-esque world. It's crazy.
These fucking nut jobs. I mean, I've got my kinks, and I'm certainly nerdier about films than the average man in the street or woman in the street. But I mean, come on, why?
Wow. I loved it. I just thought this is complete immersion and a complete desire to experience that fantasy. And like you just said, that fantasy has got different connotations now, and it's alarming, those connotations. But that world still seems thousands of years away, even though we are in a precarious political position. It just still seems so fantastical, and I don't know, they all just look so happy to be there, and I think that's it's the bizarre juxtaposition. You're in a nuclear wasteland, but they're just really, really happy to be there and sharing and bartering, and there's kind of like a fight system from the film Salute of the Jugger. So you can jug and you can become a jugger and fight, and it's just it's bonkers, absolutely bonkers. But it's well worth having a look at purely for the
I've
depth.
always,
And
as much as I love Mad Max 2, I think to me, that's the most kind of accomplished in a way.
Mm,
Obviously, they went back and stripped it back to their sort of classic narrative structure, which kind of makes sense in a way that, the first film arguably is more sort of all over the place.
mhm.
But I've always, in some ways, I kind of admire the first film more because I think and to tap into what you're saying, I think it's kind of more disturbing in that the things happened in
Mm.
two, and it's about
Yeah,
the survival. Whereas in the first one, it's not really kicked off yet, and it's kind of you can see society crumbling in at the edges, and it's getting there, and that's a kind of more terrifying concept in a way. Once it's done, it's done.
yeah,
It's the build up that is kind of more frightening in a way. So
yeah.
I've kind of always had more of a soft spot for the first film. I think. I've always loved the second film, but um, it took me a while to get into the first film. But once you do, it's kind of it's just it's a crazier
Yeah.
Australian film, and it's much more akin to. And I love Australian cinema. I think. And it's a shame that it's not really appreciated as much as it is by other people. It's like I do, film courses at the Broadway regularly. I've been doing them now for like 10 years. And I'm not just saying, they tend to either sell really well or they sell out.
Mm.
They're popular courses, But the one course I did, which didn't sell well at all, was on Australian cinema, and it just people aren't interested. It's a weird one because I
Yeah,
think it's a really fascinating,
yeah, definitely.
um, almost like a subgenre in itself, and it's the whole history of it is brilliant. I think, but people aren't just not digging it.
It's a strange thing. Ozploitation is just there's some extraordinary cinema out there, and it's just got it is very, very unique, and I think that's its appeal for me. You're watching an Australian film when you're watching an Australian film. There's some distinctiveness to it which really appeals to me, and it's just sort of like, yeah, it is a bit strange that it's not so sort of broadly engaged with. It is academically, but I don't think sort of across the wider culture of cinema, it sort of its distinctiveness is sort of there, but not fully engaged with. But yeah, it's a shame. Well worth watching.
Well, talking about things that are well worth watching. So we're going to get to the film slightly later on, but I think that we can't really talk about the film we're going to be looking at today without um, talking about the pre-code era. Now, for those that don't know, just very quickly, I don't want to go necessarily into the do a deep dive on this, but essentially, for those that don't know, the pre-code era was this kind of, depending on your point of view, was a kind of a wonderful time in Hollywood, where the production code. I mean, what's confusing is that people it's called the pre-code era as in like the code didn't exist. That's not true. The code did exist. It's just that it was ignored. So the code was basically the production code, which was meant to be a system of guidelines which the studios would adhere to. But given that we got from and this code this pre-code era existed between sort of 1930 and 1934, and um but obviously because of the depression and the slumping sort of audiences going to cinemas, I think there around that time there's about sort of 30% less people going to the cinema. You know, studios kind of had to weigh the balance and think, well, what's is it worth getting into trouble or getting a slap on the wrist if we're getting audiences in? And because the people who were, it was called, it was nicknamed the Hayes Code because of William Hayes, who was kind of ostensibly in charge of it. But actually, during that first period, it wasn't strictly adhered to, certainly by studios, and it wasn't really um, that well monitored, really. So studios got away with a lot more between 1930 and 1934, and of course, horror films came into their own in America at that point. Around the same time you get this pre-code era, you're getting films like Dracula, Frankenstein, all of these wonderful sort of 1930s horror films, Dr. X, all of these kind of brilliant films, which play fast and loose with the rules, really. And it was this brilliant time. And then sort of post 1934, it didn't change immediately. You still had films like Bride of Frankenstein in 35, Wolf of London, and the completely deliriously bonkers and perverse Mad Love. So people were still getting away with stuff post 1934, but certainly the censors and the mechanisms for controlling these films became much stricter from that point on. And by the time you get to the end of the 30s, you aren't seeing the likes of those early 1930s horror films that we had in the pre-code era. I mean, if you want to make a very quick kind of a very quick example, if you look at the difference between, say, 1931's Frankenstein by James Whale and at the end of the decade, Son of Frankenstein. It's very markedly different. You aren't getting away with the stuff that you could get away with in the beginning of the decade. So, what's your take on the pre-code era, James?
I think you summed it up quite well there, really. I think one of the key things for me is that the studios sort of got together, the executives and the heads got together to try and sort it out because they wanted self-regulation. And through sort of my understanding of it, my education of it, and my awareness of it, that for me sort of always stands out, this notion that they recognized the need to be policed, but they wanted to police themselves. And there's that air, particularly in the era, the pre-code era that we're talking about, there's that air of wanting to control as much as possible content in order to get tickets. And I think the other thing that's important for me is the fact that it occurred at the time of the Depression, so the stock market crash. There was mass unemployment, the Dust Bowl era begins, and there's this sort of strange juxtaposition between a society that's not in ruin, but is certainly facing quite severe time, juxtaposed with almost a rise in cinema and radio and senses of entertainment. So on the one hand, you've got this grim realism of mass unemployment, very poor people, the Dust Bowl era, like I said, there's a migration taking place across the country to try and find work. And that's juxtaposed with the fantasy of cinema, the fantasy of radio, and it sort of balances itself out. And that's in a weird way where horror fits in. It's sort of like people living in an extreme situation can pay with what little money they've got to go and see another extreme but fantastical situation. I think it's also quite interesting to talk about how these films were banned and considered extreme, whereas today, I mean, my copy of the Island of Lost Souls is a PG, whereas when it was first released, it was banned. So this kind of notion of a sense of morality definitely starting to emerge, which obviously is a word that we use a lot when we talk about censorship and control. But it's that thing about self-policing that really sort of intrigues me because I'm not convinced, and I think you sort of suggested it in your overview of it. They weren't that keen on self-policing themselves. They were much more interested in looking at the rules and seeing how can we bend them? How can we flex them to get the provocative, aggressive, gory, nasty imagery in there and get away with it? And like you said, I think they were prepared to take a little slap on the wrist if that meant that the film industry survived and the tickets sold.
Yeah, I mean, we shouldn't run away with the idea that it was completely lawless and that,
No,
there
no,
was still
definitely. Yeah.
you know, obvious restrictions. You couldn't show, you weren't going to show full frontal nudity
Mm,
and all this kind of stuff. All those kind of, in some ways, the pre-code films of Hollywood, they weren't as risque in some
mm,
ways as the sort of more European films from the same era, but in terms of Hollywood, they
yeah.
were more extreme. And I think that I think what's interesting is because if you talk about that I'm going to be running a course at the Broadway called Pre-Code Horror, and I think what's interesting about that era, I mean, there are a number of books on the subject of pre-code cinema, but my favorite one is by Thomas Doherty. It's just called Pre-Code Hollywood, and he spends a lot of time talking about the pre-code horror films, but not exclusively. He talks about all
Mhm.
the sort of genres of cinema at that point, gangster films, all this kind of stuff. But I think what's interesting for me is that in that pre-code era, the horror films, especially, Universal became synonymous with horror films at that point, and arguably Dracula and Frankenstein kind of saved the studio from going under, and horror really rescued them. So it became their kind of stock in trade for a little bit. Um, but actually, if you look at the wider pre-code era and the studios, because obviously, um, once Universal had established that shtick, and it would prove to be popular, obviously other studios wanted to do the same thing. So it's very quickly followed up by Paramount and Warner Brothers and RKO, all wanting really to get
Yeah.
a piece of that pie. But I think in some ways, as much as I absolutely love those early Universal films, obviously Frankenstein, and later on you get Bride of Frankenstein and all those kind of things. I think in some ways the pre-code films that other studios were putting out were probably more extreme than the Universal
Mm,
films. If you look at and I think obviously there was this kind of feeling of one-upmanship as well,
mm,
and I think something like Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, Ruben Mamoulian's Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, really,
yeah.
I've spoke a lot about this, and it really does push the envelope in terms of sex and sexuality, and this idea that, you know, it's my assertion that Jekyll is fully in control of what he's doing.
Yeah.
This is
Yeah.
this is not the same story as Werewolf of London or later on the Wolfman, where there is this sense of tragedy.
Yeah.
There's a lack of control. This is not, and that's the most terrifying thing about that
Mm,
film, and it's most disturbing, sort of pre-code pushing sort of element of that film. And I think also films like Doctor X from Warner Brothers, it's it's very sick and perverse, and
mm,
there are these kind of, and the thing, there's another book I was going to mention as well, which again is not, um it's not exclusive about the pre-code era, but it does concentrate a lot of time on that. It's a book called Monsters in the Closet,
yeah.
and it's really talking about how queer a lot
Yeah.
of those pre-code films were, whether they were, whether you were leaning towards kind of the more James Whale side of things, or later on Dracula's daughter with these kind of lesbian overtones and stuff
Yeah.
like that, or whether they were kind of othering the idea of queer or
Mm.
turning queer into a monstrous thing. They were kind of full of that kind of queer imagery, these pre-code films, and I think that was another very, very subversive thing for the time.
And that sort of brings us to the film, really, doesn't it? Because all the things you've sort of kind of listed there are drawn into this film. And I must admit, watching it again, I was I was genuinely shocked that that content that we will hopefully discuss is in it. It's not hidden. It's not sort of couched in any way. It's just like this is what I want to happen with these two people, and this is how I've done things before, and this is how I intend to do things afterwards. And it's very blunt. It doesn't try and couch anything. And I think it it's always I always find it problematic when I was teaching. You would present films like this to a young audience and say, this is shocking content, this is problematic content. And the reaction is, well, it's not. And I think we always have to think about, well, we're watching it in 2026. It would have been released in the 1930s when there was a completely different society and culture around cinema. And we can't put ourselves in that position. It's not possible. But we can imagine what an audience that were being experiencing the things that we've discussed, like the poverty and the lack of work and things like that, might have felt about a film like that. So I think we are dealing with quite shocking stuff. We are dealing with lots of exploration of sex and sexuality, sexual identity, sort of almost like distrust of authority as well. We're dealing with a doctor figure, someone who we should trust, a person that should heal, and then they're not doing any healing whatsoever. And it's crackers, absolutely crackers, to see that this film in amongst all the others, and particularly like Jekyll and Hyde. It's almost like Jekyll and Hyde and the Island of Lost Souls would make a great double bill because they're both discussing not just the beast in man, which is just a very obvious reading, but the sort of like the perversity of sex within man and what that means and how that can be played out. Because to be fair, I find Charles Lawton extremely creepy in the film. He is beyond perverse.
Well, yes, we are. Yeah, the film we're going to be looking at is Island of Lost Souls, directed by Earl C. Kenton from 1932.
You're convinced that the thing on this table isn't human.
Its cries are human.
Do you know what it is, what I began with?
No.
An animal.
So when did you first come across this film,
It probably
James?
would have been when I was at university, when I was first sort of introduced to film studies, because my degree is actually in photographic studies. I'm a photographer in terms of my degree, but we also did film studies as part of it. And it's where I was introduced to an awful lot of cinema that I would never have engaged with. So a lot of westerns, a lot of gangster films, and we touched upon horror. And one of them that we watched on the cinema screen was The Island of Lost Souls, and it was just like, this is absolutely amazing. This is I can't believe the content of this film in light of the era it was made. And then we watched it, and then we were taught about the Hays Code and all of the other things, and Jacqueline Hyde and the film, like Dr. X, like you said, and all the things that were before it and after it, and how it impacted to an extent on cinema and censorship. So that was my first encounter, and then I just kind of kept my eye out for it every time. If I could see it, I'd watch it because it's just a wrong film.
That's a good way of putting it. It's brilliant. I love it.
Mm.
But it is, yeah. I mean, I rewatched it again yesterday, and I've been obviously studying it and reading about it for the course I'm going to be running at the Broadway. But it's, yeah, and I have spoken about it before on other occasions, and it is something which is it really, I think in some ways. This is the thing, I think. Obviously it went out in the 1932. So depending on where you saw it, you might have seen a slightly edited version or
Yeah.
whatever. And obviously it went on to be banned in the UK for a number of years, and in several other territories as well. In some ways, though, looking at it now through 21st century eyes, it's almost, I mean, I have no idea how an audience member might have reacted in the 1930s. We can make assumptions. There are kind of anecdotal accounts and stuff, but I don't know. But it's almost like it's almost more shocking through 21st century
Yeah.
eyes, because
Yeah.
and I think this is the thing about those pre-code films, especially this film and a film like Freaks, is that we when I say we, I mean like general audiences. They are expecting a certain thing from a 1930s film, and that they view 1930s, it's black and white, it's innocent, it's a bit cheesy, it's a bit corny, it's all this, all these kind of cliches, all these kind of assumptions people make about 1930s films. And then suddenly, if you really watch this, not just have it on in the background, if you really watch this and concentrate on it, and you listen to the dialogue, and you listen to what's being said, and you listen to all these things, and you hear what's being said, because they don't show you that much, and that's the thing. People think, well, it's not that shocking because it's makeup, and it's not that, all of this kind of stuff. Actually, no, what's being suggested, what's being overtly
Mm.
mentioned or talked about is deeply shocking, and it's
Yeah.
really, really disconcerting
Mm.
from a modern audience point of view. I think there are lines in this film. We'll get to all the kind of animal creatures and all that kind of stuff and the physical stuff in a minute, but the whole, I was going to say subtext, but it's almost not
No.
subtext. It's almost text.
Yeah,
It's
it's text,
the
definitely.
the idea that. So you've got Moreau on the island, but also the first person we come across is Montgomery, and who immediately lets us not the first kind of dialogue exchange we get with Montgomery and Parker is this. He's Parker's been rescued from so they get him onto this ship. Montgomery sort of sees to him, and they have this exchange where Parker says, are you a doctor? And we have this kind of almost looking to the camera, breaking the fourth wall. Montgomery says, well, I used to be, or words to that effect. And then later on, we get this exchange, and it's basically we are not so many words. We are basically told that Montgomery is not a doctor anymore because he was essentially written off for um peccadillo, shall we say. And it's heavily implied that there has been some sort of sexual, or some sort of, he's been part of some sort of sexual
Mm.
assault, or he's done something he shouldn't be doing as a medical doctor. And it's also given dialogue that comes from the wonderful Charles Lawton in this, who was a gay man himself.
Mm.
Despite the
Yeah.
fact he was married to Elsa Lanchester,
Yeah.
he was very much a gay man. And he said, at one point he says to Montgomery, he's a fair sort of sailor. now, now, within the context of that dialogue, you
Yeah.
could pass it off. Well, he's he's obviously been on a ship. He knows his way out, but
Yeah.
we know really
Mm. Yeah.
what Lawton's saying when he delivers that dialogue, particularly with the twinkle in his eye. You can always he's almost kind of twizzling his moustache when he says that. There are so many instances of things like that within this, and the fact that the exchange. I mean, we'll talk about Kathleen Burke in a second, but the Panther Woman. Um, again, there is this exchange with Montgomery and Moreau, where they're planning basically to essentially put Parker and the Panther Woman together in the hope that they will mate. And they have this
Mm.
exchange where he says, will she act like a woman in those circumstances? And kind of Montgomery glances across at Moreau, and Moreau says, "Oh, what we did doesn't count." I mean,
What?
what is even being
Yeah.
suggested there? This film is so horrible, so horrific, and it's just it genuinely shocks me even
Mm.
now. I think that they
I
got
think
away with it.
it's the dialogue that does it, and the dialogue sort of comes out of the screen. It impacts you, and but it then immediately, excuse me, rebounds back into the character, so that you're you're kind of disturbed by Moreau and Montgomery anyway. I think the performances alone, I mean, when they're not talking, their performances are disturbing. But the more they talk about the secret of his island and what they have actively done, they've actively chosen to do it and are actively doing it, it becomes even more and more and more and more disturbing. So beyond the plot of trying, I mean, mate's the right word, isn't it? Because we're dealing with humans and animals and they want that to happen. But it's what's gone on before we get to the island that is perhaps even more disturbing. What have they gone through, which is communicated through the dialogue, to get to that point where this poor innocent guy ends up washed up quite literally on their shores, and it's like a gold mine to them too. It's like, oh, this is fantastic, this is exactly what we need. Another specimen, another opportunity to explore the disturbing things we want to deal with. But in their minds, it's all in medical science, isn't it? It's all in the progress of science and the progress of humanity, when it's not. It's just a perverse, I can't say it any other way, it's just a perverse line of inquiry that they're both so entrenched in, they can no longer see the horror of what they're doing. I mean, that doesn't even draw into the fact of the law giving and how Moreau tries to control his creations, how he claims he's a god, all of these things. I mean, they're other like satellite problems that are going on in the film.
Well, it's also the fact that I mean, obviously this is based on The Island of Dr. Moreau by H.G. Wells, and H.G. Wells, famously hated this
Mm,
incarnation
yeah, it
of
did.
the text, which I'm not saying is. I think he was wrong on that. I mean, you got to remember H.G. Wells. He was a Victorian gent. He was coming
Yeah,
from the
yeah.
19th century. So cinema was a relatively new thing, to him. So I think people were still trying to establish what the rules were, what cinema what was, and what it could do. So I get why he wouldn't have liked this, and but I think it is interesting. He didn't really. I mean, because he didn't really like the idea of the Invisible Man, even though they did manage to get his permission to do that later on, and he kind of gave his okay, which eventually became Wales' version. But I think it's interesting that the one film he did like of his work was Things to Come, which
Mm,
which is arguably is because he wrote the screenplay for, so which I think is an interesting film, but it's certainly in terms of 1930s Wells adaptations, it's the least interesting.
yeah,
It's the least successful, I think. Not in terms of financially, but just in terms of what it does. It's nowhere near as entertaining or as cinematic in some ways as Island of Lost Souls or The Invisible Man, which are both equally perverse in very different
Yeah.
ways. But yes, I think he is wrong. But I do think that, the so I can understand why he would not like it or see it as being kind of a diversion from his novel, which because I think it absolutely is in many ways. And I think also, whereas Moreau in the book is clearly insane,
Mm.
um, it starts off as with everything, as with a Frankenstein, as with a Jekyll. It starts off with a good intention,
Yeah.
but whereas in this adaptation, Moreau in this, played by Lawton, and given the script he's got, there is absolutely no indication that there is anything good about this is purely evil science for the sake of
Mhm.
evil science.
Yeah.
There's no rhyme or reason to what he's
Yeah.
doing. There is absolutely not a hint that this will improve or benefit mankind other than his particular god complex. There is not
Yeah.
none, we are not there is not even one single iota of evidence that what he is
Mm.
doing might help another human being. I love
You're
it for
right.
that.
There's absolutely nothing in it. It's almost like he's had a curious thought and he's lost sight that it was just curiosity. What would happen if I merge a human with an animal or an animal with a human? I wonder what that would be. And instead of just leaving that there, instead of leaving that fundamental, like a scientific question, what would happen? Curious question. He instead goes, well, no, I'll find out then, and I will do it in lots of dubious ways. It's alluded to that he starts this behaviour in London. He does all of these things in London, realizes that he can't do it in London, goes to this strange little island, and it just becomes an island of the unethical, doesn't it? It's just beyond unethical what he's doing, because it's not just the curiosity and the God complex. It's the way in which he treats his creations that he doesn't deem worthy of his scalpel, really. And those are the problems, or in his eyes, the mistakes. He treats them really badly. And on top of that, he then tries to use one of them in an effort to once again instigate some sort of reproduction between human animal hybrid and a human. And that's where I mean, the film goes off the scale, then, doesn't it, really? Because there is an awareness with Panther Woman that she is aware of what she is. She knows what she is. She doesn't understand her attraction to Parker. Parker's been lied to. So there's all of those sort of things floating around in that relationship. But then when Ruth, Parker's fiance, turns up, the film just literally goes off the scale. It goes off the charts. What Moreau wants to happen, and the fact that he gets one of the most ugliest, most violent, most grotesque of his creations, and almost orchestrates it, trying to break into Ruth's room to. We don't even need to say it. We know exactly what's going to happen, and it's not going to be consensual. It's just hugely problematic. I don't know how you can, in some respects, it defies talking about, doesn't it? Because it is beyond horrific what he wants to do and what he's done.
Well, I mean, one of um the rules or the guidelines set
Mm,
out by the production code, which a lot of these films flagrantly ignored. But one of the rules which they kind of did adhere to, because I think it would have been seen as being, for open, even shocking for even
mm,
the pre-code era, was this idea of you weren't allowed to show miscegenation, this idea of,
mm. Yeah.
a black and white couple coming together with, it's clearly very wrong-headed and
Mm,
ridiculous, um, but the way they kind of get around it and take it one step further, and it goes down all sorts of avenues, which, you know, again through 21st century eyes is completely, debased. This idea that the creature that he basically sets loose on
Mm,
Ruth with the intention that this creature is going to, sexually assault her, rape her, whatever you want to call it. This creature is very dark skinned. It's not,
mm,
it's not a black actor playing that, but it's deliberately, you know, um, underscored as being this is a dark skinned character. And it kind of like underline, this, for all we, we can sit here as white dudes, discussing these films as being brilliant, and because they are brilliant, they are interesting, they are fascinating, I love them. But we've got to address the problematic
yeah,
stuff, because the thing with the pre-code era, it wasn't just about, going up against the censors. It was being allowed to do stuff which we would absolutely find
yeah,
abhorrent, or not acceptable now. So these films, as well as being full of interesting ideas and subversion and sort of perverse, or as being these kind of subversive piece of arts, they were also riddled with kind of racism and
yeah.
sexism and misogyny and all this kind of
Right with
stuff.
it. It's absolutely
Yeah.
right with it. I mean, the first thing that I wrote it down. When Parker first meets Panther Woman, there's this whole kind of like South Seas exoticism running through it, and he says to her, "What island are you from? Tahiti or Samoa?" He frames her as someone not American, and he frames her as someone from the South Seas. He frames her as someone that's exotic, and she's, if I remember correctly, she's dressed in a slightly exotic way. She's got like a grass skirt on, I think, and I think she's also got like a necklace of flowers. All of these sort of very cliched signifiers that are, on the one hand, oh look, this is exotic and it's erotic, it's different to us. But there's the problem. They are markedly making her different to the white American hero. And I think when you were talking about the creature, the hybrid that he lets loose on Ruth, that to me, when I was watching it again, it's just so starkly juxtaposed with how white Charles Lawton is. It's not just that he's a white actor, his suit is white and
Yes.
it's bleached white by the intensity of the sun in this sort of atoll that he lives on. And he's impeccably clean. He is the complete opposite of animal, whatever that might be. And whilst we may be conscious or unconscious of that, it's still working. And it just makes anything that isn't in his sort of ethical sphere is it's not clean. It's the complete opposite. It's not pure. And that's sort of, it just ramps up not just the horror of what's going on, because it's this white intellectual scientific, well, it's almost pseudo-scientifical in some respects, scientific doctor lording it over and godlike over people that he perceives are way lesser than him. So reading those analogies, it is a great film, but it is also massively, massively problematic in what it's actually saying. And it's disturbing because you can kind of read those Hollywood films as going against the system. They're booking against it. They're fighting their own set of rules. Yet really they're fueling an inherent set of problems that are across all culture, I guess. They're kind of fueling a very negative ideology. And perhaps that's why I think the ending's so interesting, is because we can talk a lot about the science of it and the horror of Moreau, but he does get his comeuppance. And
Yeah.
is that, and there's a shift then in meaning, I think, in that the hybrid animals, or the hybrid human animals, they become like, it's wrong to say the working class, but people that are not part of Moreau's sphere revolt, because Moreau doesn't stick to his own rules, and therefore they shouldn't. And there's this kind of massive revolt at the end where, however you want to frame that society of individuals, revolts against Moreau, and he always stays fixed, doesn't he? I don't think his meaning or his signification changes. He's always this white figure of science, this intellectual Westerner. He's
Yeah,
always that.
there's no learning curve for Moreau.
No, he's
He's dragged
nailed
dragged
just,
kicking
isn't
and
he?
screaming to the house of pain. You know,
Yeah,
that's
and
it.
that sums it up, doesn't it? The fact that he is so fixed in his position, in meaning and in purpose and value in the film, he is literally dragged away from it, isn't he? Like you said, he's kicking and screaming to the house of pain, and that's where his comeuppance, his long due comeuppance, takes place. But I think you're right. It's kind of like there are lots of ways of which it's not just Moreau that does it. Reading those films and sort of saying, yeah, they are a brilliant milestone in cinema, a milestone in censorship, and a milestone in the horror genre. But we also have to look at them, like you said, they're just massively, massively problematic. And that dampens it, doesn't it? That takes something away from it.
If you, I mean, yeah, like you said, Moreau, it wasn't, you know, Lost Souls was far from being. It's one of the most extreme examples, I think, but it's not. It wasn't alone, you know.
Mm.
The idea that if you look at from the same year, you've got White Zombie, you know, the Halperin
Yeah.
brothers' White Zombie, which, you know, if you think why, you know, the film's set in Haiti, and at the time that the film was set, it would be a few months later, it wouldn't be the case. But while with the, a couple of years later, sorry, it wouldn't be the case. But while well, even though they didn't film one stitch of it in Haiti, it was all filmed in Hollywood, on the same Universal set. They borrowed Universal sets
Mm.
because it was a Poverty Row sort of production, but they borrowed Universal sets. They worked on like sets from Dracula and things like that.
Mm.
However, it's set in Haiti, and at the same time that the film was going out, America was still very much occupying Haiti at that time. And you can look at as much, you know, it's kind of a daft horror film, you know, it's a daft
Mm.
early first kind of zombie film, if you like. But at the same time, it's shocking in a way because these kind of more that we view with kind of modern sensibility, it kind of comes back to smack us in the face because it's really sort of it really does highlight, and like you say, it signifies this this, you know, this ongoing sort of racism that
Mm.
was inherent in the culture at that time, you know. The most shocking thing about White Zombie in some ways is that it's called White Zombie.
Mm.
You know, people forget that. You know, it's White Zombie because at the heart of this story, it's a white woman who is zombified,
Mm.
which is kind of the most shocking thing you could do because actually before that, most of the zombie characters are black and
Mm.
they are very quickly disregarded straight away. And the idea of voodoo and zombification of black characters is almost there. It's almost a justification for all those kind of years of slavery and the Jim Crow laws and all this kind of stuff. Because you know, if you let the implication being if you let black people just get on with things and allow them this freedom, they'll revert to things like voodoo and stuff like this. It's all as you said, it's brilliant. I enjoy watching this kind of stuff. I you know, atmospherically, all of these films are incredible. They broke new ground in cinema, but yeah, you can't address these films without
Mm.
looking at the sort of more problematic stuff. Um, and also as well with Lost Souls, as well as films like White Zombie and even things like The Black Cat from 34. Um, and, you know, this is not me sort of asserting this, even though I do agree with it, but it's people like Alison Pierce and Ben Schoff with his Monsters in the Closet
Mm.
book. They kind of look at this idea that even though on the surface these films are seemingly at the heart of them there is kind of a heterosexual romance, actually that often that's used as a kind of a MacGuffin actually,
Mm.
in say, White Zombie. Obviously, the center of attraction is the Madeline, who is turned into this white zombie, and but it's very heavily implied that Beaumont and Legendre are almost coming together in this sexual pact, and the female character is there as a kind of MacGuffin. It's just not really
Mm.
that, and you could argue that the Black Cat, that's got Lugosi and Karloff coming, and I'm
Mm.
sure Lugosi and Karloff weren't aware of this or didn't even think of it like this, but it's a sadistic
Mm.
homoerotic relationship they have, and I think that is repeated over and over again. I mean, if you look at what happens to Kathleen Burke, the Panther Woman in this film,
Yeah.
it's very much, it's almost like there is this almost this suggestion that Moreau is so obsessed with his work, or he's so kind of perverse, he's almost gone beyond that, and he's almost impotent, and he has to use Parker as a kind of surrogate, sexual sort of, he sends uh Parker into this kind of situation with the Panther Woman because he can't perform, or he's
Mm.
doing this kind of vicariously. It's very messed up sexually, I think.
Yeah, I mean, you kind of get the impression that he he doesn't want to participate in that behavior because it means a different sort of interaction. His only physical interaction that he wants with the hybrids is to mutilate, isn't it, really? Or in more sort of perhaps politer terms, he wants to vivisect them, to make them into the hybrids. And that's his sort of his, I mean, it's weird to say, but it's his level of penetration, isn't it? He's cutting them open, he's blending them together, he's stitching them together. That's his level of interaction, of physical interaction with them. From that point on, once they're an entity to themselves, he controls them with a whip, which has got, again, massive problematic connotations with it. They're both animal and both repressed at the same time. But the whole idea that he should interact with them sexually, it possibly hasn't even occurred to him because it's just so like it's never going to happen because that's just not what I'm here. But Parker, he's of the right type or the right social standing or the right structure to interact at that level. I think the other thing we have to sort of bear in mind about that is we can talk a lot about how it's massively problematic as both the woman, Panther Woman, being an animal and being framed as someone who's from the South Seas and is exotic. But there's also Parker. Parker doesn't. He's got a, he's engaged. He doesn't go out of his way to prevent any of this. He's like, oh, okay. Well, you're an attractive woman. I think he alludes to that quite a bit. And it's only when he realizes that she is a hybrid that he doesn't want to have anything to do with her. But up until that point, I think you get the vague impression that he's like, well, no one's here to see. I'm here on an isolated island, and when I get rescued, because there's inevitability in his mind, he'll be rescued. No one will be any of the wiser, and I'll go back to my normal, very stable life with my fiancée Ruth. But so to me, watching it again, Parker isn't entirely innocent. I mean, he's innocent in how he's thrust into this situation, but he's not innocent in how he deals with it. He's almost part of the pact that Montgomery and Moreau are making. He becomes the third part of that pact. So I don't know. What do you think? Is he up
Well,
to no good as well?
I mean, yeah. I mean, well, yeah. Clearly, he doesn't hang about, does he? Like he's straight. He's um all the Panther Woman does is kind of drape herself across him, and he's in. That's it.
Hmm.
It's no worries. And again, it's kind of leaning into that kind of built-in kind of misogyny from that
Hmm.
era
Yeah.
he's just a red-blooded male, and what else do you expect? What's going to
Hmm.
happen? If someone throws herself at him, then what's he to do other than take full advantage of that because there's all that, but also I think on a wider level, it's almost like the whole setup. Obviously, it leans into that idea of colonialism and that
Yeah.
sick-minded kind of attitude, all those sick-minded attitudes that were that just there at the time and unquestioned at the time that we are better, and I think if you look at it that way, if you look at Moreau as this kind of perverse missionary type character who goes to this island, he runs away
Mhm.
from civilized society because of his mutilated dog experiments and all this
Mm.
kind of all these shenanigans, goes to this island and uses the native, if we look at animals as being a metaphor for native islanders, it's almost, well, look, I in my godlike white capacity, I'm going to make you not human, but more human.
Mm.
So you'll fit in. However, you'll still be third class citizens. You won't ever be strictly human. You won't because you're not white enough. You're not
Mm.
Western enough. And I think that there are all those kind of connotations as well.
It reminds me of how Panther Woman is very similar to, well, her narrative trajectory is very similar to the trajectory of Indigenous American women in early cinema. So what would happen is a white American would arrive, there'd be problems between the indigenous American culture and this white American settler. Now, it's always important to remember that this white American settler, pretty much like Parker, has got a fiance at home, wherever home may be, but she's not involved yet in this dispute. In this dispute, the indigenous American woman, usually young, will fall for the white American settler and try and aid and abet him in doing whatever he wants to do, be that overthrow her own people or claim land, gold, whatever it might be. And in order to do that, she sort of submits to him. He sort of submits to her, but keeps his distance. And then she dies, usually saving him, or in some instances, she'll die actually saving his white settler fiance. And often she'll die in his arms. She'll sort of go, "Oh, I still love you, even though you're the most evil person alive, and you've turned me against my own culture." She'll die in his arms, and that sort of makes me think about Panther Woman in that she's sort of like paralleled in the same way with her narrative that she falls for Parker. Like you said, she drapes herself all over him, and she aids and abets Parker in the escape from the island as the film draws towards its end. But I mean, she's killed, isn't she? She dies at the end of the film, and it just sort of like, yeah, excuse me, that's an interesting sort of parallel that's just come to my mind. But it just totally reinforces that whole colonial reading of the film, and that sort of perhaps cycles back to how I described Moreau's costume. It's pure white, isn't it? It's just this colonial white. It just reinforces and reinforces his whiteness and his superiority and his attitude and that air of, disdain that he's got about him about anything other than himself. I mean, he's even disgusted by Montgomery at certain points, isn't he? He's just like, "Oh, Montgomery, you're just not you're just not capable of the level of thinking or understanding that I am. Get out of the way." I'm surprised Montgomery's survived in some scenes.
Well, I mean, we talk about Kathleen Burke for a minute, because obviously, famously, the sort of pre-production kind of hoo-ha and the publicity was all wrapped up in this competition where
Yeah.
they put out, they created this character of the Panther Woman, which is not in the original novel. And in order to sell the film in the pre-production sort of phase, they had this competition where they were going to make a new star. So they got people to apply to this competition, and there were thousands and thousands of
Mm.
entries, and in the end they plucked, Kathleen Burke, and she the contract was basic. Well, she got like I think it was a year-long contract, something like
Yeah.
that. It wasn't like huge, and so she'd get to star in Island of Lost Souls, and then she'd get a contract, and she went on sort of fairly quickly after this, and she appeared in Murders in the Zoo, which is
Yeah.
another just
Yeah. It's
very
it's
very
very
wrong
similar.
film.
Yeah. Yeah. Very
um,
similar.
yeah, but I mean, what's interesting is that all the publicity for the film was kind of that they unleashed before it had been all this kind of the competition stuff to enhance the press media attention on this film kind of worked initially, and it obviously generated a lot of interest. But I think what's interesting, I've been reading quite a lot about this film recently, is the post production when the film was released, critically, actually, Kathleen Burke was more or less ignored. That
Yeah.
she was kind of like written out the picture. Critically, most people were focused in honing in on Charles Lawton, his
Yeah.
performance. So
Yeah.
but also I think that idea of the publicity. I mean, this is what also makes this kind of pre-code era seem so incongruous compared to how we handle publicity for things now, in terms of people are so careful, also in terms of, you're not going to put out salacious material for children, all this kind of stuff. It was just a very different world there. I mean,
Mm.
one of my favorite stories is, and this is real as well, it's not me making it up, this is not a myth, is the, to publicize The Black Cat, which is one of the most perverse films ever made. If you've never seen The Black Cat from 1934, starring Lugosi and Karloff, you need to go and see that. Seek it out. It's alongside this film, it's one of the most perverse kind of pre-code films. But in order to publicize that film, they held a competition where they asked kids to bring their black cats so they could do a photo opportunity. It's just the idea of the young kids being involved
Mm.
in any aspect of that piece of
Yeah.
cinema is just it it beggars belief, because that film is not it's so far away from child's material that it's unbelievable. So it was just a very different world,
Mm.
and again, obviously in this country from 1932 we had the H for horrific or horror certificate, which in theory, precluded under 16s from seeing
Mm.
horror movies. But it was only a guideline, so you didn't have to necessarily stick to it. Although some local authorities, did use it as an excuse to ban under 16s from any kind of
Yeah.
subversive material or whatsoever. But I think, in America and for a long time, this idea that there was this kind of delineation of this is a film for adults and this is a film for children. Didn't really happen. It was kind of like
Yeah.
people just went to see things, and so you're dealing with those kind of attitudes, and I think the the idea of kids maybe watching this is
Mm.
slightly disturbing now. I think,
It
uh,
is. Would a child even get the what's
no,
going on?
probably not. But
Yeah.
yeah, but just it's almost like, even if they don't understand how they're being corrupted by it,
Mm.
I feel that just by
Yeah.
exposing them to it, they are being
Yeah.
corrupted by it. That
But that,
said,
but
even though it was banned for years and you couldn't actually see it in this country for a long time, if it had have been part of those glorious kind of BBC Two double bills of the 70s and 80s,
mm.
I would have loved it. I would have wanted to watch it as a 8 or 9 year old kid. Absolutely.
I can see it alongside, for some reason, the Quatermass Experiment. Just those two. There's that kind of weird sort of synergy between them of science, crazy scientists, but also real, for the time, cutting edge things going in it and problematic ideas around science and the notion of trust that we probably would have had innocently. Oh, that man's educated. It is a man, isn't it? It's always a man. An educated man. He's qualified. He's a good, fine, upstanding member of the community. And it turns out that they're not. They're far from it. And as you said when we first started discussing the film, Montgomery's part of that as well. And that's why he's on Moreau's Island. It's not just an island of lost souls. It's an island of disrepute. It's an island of failed medicine, and almost like a testament to the liberties that these men have been given by their education and by their qualification and experience. And instead of using it for good, they've just, I mean, they're exploiting indigenous peoples. They're conducting arcane experiments. And one of them has convinced himself he's a god. And it's just, no wonder it got banned. It's just an
Also,
affront to the Hays
like you
Code.
say, I think it's just this idea that, you know, this is quite, for all those kind of problematic elements, which are definitely there, this film in some ways is kind of forward thinking in terms of, if you compare this to, say, those early 70s films from the States, where these deeply sort of cynical, sort of anti-authority type films, or conspiracy laden films of the early 70s, it's almost got some of that, because if on the surface, authority is not to be trusted. Authority is deeply corrupted, whether
Yeah,
it's a doctor, whether it's Moreau, a scientist, whether it's the captain of a ship who's literally drunk in charge.
yeah, yeah.
You know,
He even says if there's any drinking to take place, I'll be doing it. He
yeah,
he actively keeps everyone sober so that he can be drunk and still command the ship, which almost leads to, if I remember correctly, that there's an animal attacks one of the people when Ruth's on the boat, doesn't it? And it's revealed there's another subtle veiled hint that these animals are going there to be butchered, which is what happens at the very beginning when Parker gets on the boat. These animals aren't going there to be a pet or to be a caged creature inside a zoo. It's going straight to the House of Pain, and it's just going to be butchered mercilessly, no doubt, by Moreau and overseen by these Montgomery.
but in that sense, again, I mean, it's almost like akin to the Hammer films, the classic Hammer horror films, which were always kind of set. And I'm not suggesting Hammer were overtly political, because they weren't. They're after making entertaining films that made money. However, a lot of the directors and writers involved would invariably put some sort of message across. And if you look at Hammer just on a surface level reading, it's always the authority figure which is corrupt
Yeah,
and is the villain. It's the count, it's the baron, it's some sort of landowner or whatever, and they get their comeuppance. And I think that with Lost Souls, you could argue, you could at a stretch look at the animals as a beleaguered workforce,
mm,
that are being systematically abused by an authority figure, and in the end rebel, because
yeah,
there is no suggestion at any point in this film that authority is either in control or is a safe bet. In some ways, it is, up until the final reel of the film, it's almost suggested you are on your own,
yeah,
you
mm,
know
yeah.
until you actually figure out what's going on and band together and get rid of this bad thing. You are on your own.
Yeah. And it takes the married couple to do it, doesn't it? Which is
Yeah.
unsurprising. Ruth has to arrive. Ruth has to be put into jeopardy. And we get the good captain as well, don't we? Who brings Ruth. He
Yes,
he
yes.
does complain about it. He does say, well, I'd get someone else to do it if they were here. I'm not doing it, but I'm the only one here, so I'll do it. And it takes the three of them to come together. And also, it takes Montgomery to have a conscience, which I think, to be fair, is possibly got right at the beginning. We see some elements of it starting to come through in some of his comments and his behaviour. But you're right, it takes someone with a conscience, it takes a heterosexual couple that are going to get married, have 2 kids and live the predicted life, and a captain, a figure of authority to, even though he's a lowly captain, it doesn't matter, he's a captain, to come together and say what you're doing is not just wrong, but it's fundamentally wrong, and the only punishment due you is at the hands of a revolution. And as we've said earlier, he does, kicking and screaming, get dragged to the House of Pain, and we see those fantastic, disturbing shots of excessively hybrid hands coming into the shot and picking up these instruments of contemporary times, the scalpel, metal crafted, sharpened instruments of destruction, not instruments of healing. They become instruments of pain, instruments of murder. And it's just, the film's fantastic for it, because it just constantly shifts fixed signifiers into other things. And I think that's what makes his death even more grotesque, is that it's just like he is getting played upon him what he has done to those that are playing it upon him, if that makes sense. It's like it's closing the circle, isn't it, of in terms of what's happening and what's happened and what is going to happen.
Yes, and talking of closing the circle, I think we're running out of time. It's been absolutely brilliant to talk about this film. I've very much enjoyed it. I've been looking forward to talking about this film for a while, and so thanks for coming back on again, James.
Thank you. It's been great. Enjoyed it. Thank you.
So remember to call round next time. Make yourself at home. You look like you're dying for a nice cup of tea for Terry.
And remember, my friend, future events such as these will affect you in the future.